As Corey mentioned, I'm Kevin Ketz. I'm the Chief Technology Officer. I've been in information security for a very long time, so long that I've seen it change from an IT function, where it was just called IT, to information security, to InfoSec, to cybersecurity, 2 words, to cybersecurity, 1 word. So that gives you any perspective. I've been around quite a long time, and I've dealt with penetration testing through that entire time. And so today we're going to talk a little bit about penetration testing and how to build a business case if you need to within your organization. First, a little bit about Risk 360. Risk 360 is an audit and compliance firm that provides audit services, advisory services, security services, privacy services. We work across multiple frameworks. We work across multiple offerings with regard to penetration testing via CISO, and we have virtual DPO offerings as well. So if you want to learn more about Risk 360, go to risk360.com and you can check out all the offerings that we have. I want to start by telling a story of a fictitious director of a security for a fintech company. And this is a fairly common penetration testing scenario. So John here is a fictitious character, AI generated image there. But John is the director of security for a fintech firm. He recently joined the firm. And as he was being onboarded, he asked, questions about the security program and was told, yeah, we do good things. And, we've had a consultant come in and do some work for us. So when he joined, his first request was, hey, has a pen test been done this year? And if so, can you share with me what was delivered? John's boss, the CIO, was super excited. Yeah, we had this guy come in, he looked at our entire operation and he did a penetration test, and here's what he provided. What John received was a Nessus scan report. And if you don't know what Nessus is, it's a vulnerability scanner that's very popular, and it generates a very prolific report. There's no real context to it, and it doesn't really constitute a penetration test. So John took that, he looked at it, he tried to explain that to his boss, and then over time what he did is he tried to pitch getting a real penetration test done. And in pitching that, he received a bunch of pushback from his boss, pushback from the COO. His boss had told him that this consultant had come in and only charged him $1,500 for all the work that he did. Why would he have to pay $35,000 just for a report? And so John took the time to learn and explain and ultimately fight the battle to get the funding for a real penetration test, and was successful. So how could he have been able to be more successful in building that case? What tools could we have given him here? And that's what we're going to walk through today. We're going to talk about the types of things that you need to put together to build a business case for penetration testing. We're going to talk about it in the context of explaining what a penetration test is, talk about the threat landscape and why penetration testing is important with regard to the threat landscape. We'll talk about the financial impact of data breaches, how it affects cybersecurity insurance, and then we'll look at how to build a ROI or cost-benefit analysis of penetration testing. And then at the end, we'll touch a little bit on how we at Risk 360 and Renegade Labs can help solve some of these problems for you. So most of us know what penetration testing is, or we've at least heard of it. Part of this presentation is geared toward more the executive level, those who aren't in the weeds and don't do a lot of penetration testing work or technical work. So I'm going to try and touch on the highlights and the high points of what is a penetration test, how it's defined by one of the frameworks. We'll talk about different types of penetration testing, and then some of what differentiates a good test from a bad test. So NIST, one of their definitions of penetration testing, I'm going to read a portion of it, not all of it, but security testing in which evaluators mimic real-world attacks in an attempt to identify ways to circumvent the security features of an application, system, or network. Penetration testing often involves issuing real attacks on real systems and data using the same tools and techniques used by the actual attackers. I'm going to stop there, and that sentence right there is really the most important thing that you can take away from this definition, is that it's issuing real attacks on real systems and data using the same tools and techniques used by actual attackers. It's important to note that good penetration testing is emulating the bad guys so you can know how vulnerable you are to their tools and techniques and procedures. So understanding that penetration testing is an emulation of a bad actor to try and identify weaknesses, or even take a bunch of different weaknesses and put them together to try and gain access to your systems or your data, you want to be able to test those capabilities and see what those bad actors may be able to accomplish. And in order to do that, you need to conduct what is called a penetration test. And there are multiple different flavors of penetration testing depending on your environment, right? So the first one is external network penetration testing. So you can think of this as penetration testing for companies that have on-prem networks, whether those are for their corporate offices or for systems running in a data center somewhere. But if you have a network and network engineers, external network penetration testing is done from the outside, looking in, trying to get access through your network perimeter. The next one up is internal network penetration testing. And essentially what we assume here is that somebody's gotten access past your perimeter, and now we're inside. And what can we see? What can we do? How can we move laterally throughout the environment? How can we escalate our privileges? Ultimately, how can we get to the crown jewels that you have on your network that you're trying to protect? So network penetration testing has two flavors, as does cloud penetration testing. And I'll talk about those kind of rolled up into one. So everybody should at this point have heard of the cloud and understand basically that the cloud is, computer services that you buy as a service that somebody else is managing large portions of. And a lot of people think that, because you're in the cloud, you're automatically secure. As we'll learn later from some of the statistics that I'm going to present, cloud misconfigurations are a huge problem. And just because you're in the cloud does not mean you're secure. So you need to engage a qualified party to come and take a look at your cloud environment from an attacker's perspective to see what misconfigurations, what vulnerabilities exist, and how far they might be able to get into your environment. Again, you need to look at it from both an internal and external perspective, starting with the external and then moving internal, so you can know that the layers of security that your team has put in place are protecting it appropriately. Up next, we have web application penetration testing. Web app testing, as it's typically called, is where not a bad actor may do it as well, but where a penetration tester is going to test web applications that you provide from your organization and look for flaws in coding, look for vulnerabilities in web servers, look for input errors that allow them to gain access to sensitive data through the use of that web application or misuse of it. In some cases, they may even look at how that web application may be used in a fraudulent way. Mobile app penetration testing is the same thing, except looking at the application on your mobile phone, on a mobile device rather, and seeing what other interesting things can be done. Can you break out of that? Can you do other things on the phone? If you root the phone, what might you be able to see? So the good guys breaking your application, trying to see what the bad guys might do with it. There are a couple of other kind of penetration tests that I'll touch on, and these are more advanced. There's red teaming and purple teaming. And really what these are exercises that are intended to not just act as an adversary and conduct the testing from the outside or even from the inside. This works in conjunction with your team to set certain objectives for the test and have a pass-fail condition for each of those objectives. So essentially what the red team does is they put together a list of TTPs or tactics, techniques, and procedures that the bad guys might use. They tell you what those TTPs are, so you can then go and research and make sure that you have protections in place, expected protection anyway, and logging and monitoring. And then when they run those exercises, you're looking at your systems to see if they catch them, if they stop them, if you see them, if you can react to them. And so the red teaming exercise is excellent for testing not only the controls, but your team's reaction to problems in the environment. Purple teaming is very similar in that you do a similar exercise. However, the trained professionals will also help your team figure out how to react to those simulated attacks, what extra things they could be doing, teaching defensive skills to your team through the process. So a lot more time than I intended to spend on the types of penetration testing, but the bottom line here is that there's standard penetration testing looking at different elements of your infrastructure, and then advanced penetration testing, red teaming and purple teaming, that not only tests technical stuff, but trains and helps build your team's ability to respond. So I talked about differentiating between a good test and a bad test. Good penetration testing, it's really important to note that there are a combination of both automated and human factors to a good penetration test. A lot of people, like John experienced, might receive a result of an automated vulnerability assessment and think that that's a penetration test. It's not, and it's not enough. You need that automation, but you also need the human side of things to make sure that the test is aligning to company objectives. There should always be a meeting that is between the testing team and the company representatives, up to and including executives, to sit down and talk about what are your objectives, what are the crown jewels, what would happen if certain things happened, and does it make sense for us to test this or that? By working to align with company objectives, then you can also start to understand what's important to them and help build a threat model if one doesn't exist, understand their attack surface, and craft specific attacks that will be leveraged and germane to their environment. So those combination of automated tools and human activities actually work in concert to prioritize what you're doing. And it should always be an interactive process between the tester and the company, because I often say this when we're talking to potential clients about testing. We could spend as much time testing as you would allow us to, but we understand there are timing constraints, there are budgeting constraints, so oftentimes we have to focus what we're doing, and that focus needs to be an interactive process. If we're going down a path that doesn't really make sense to go down, we need to talk to somebody from the business to from the client side, the customer organization, to help us redirect and focus on what's most important to them, to again align it to the company objectives. And then what's really important is the report that you receive back. And a good penetration test report is very, very important for not only you to understand what's happened, but it is the only leave behind. It is reviewed by several external parties. So you have to be confident in what's in there, how it's presented. And you want things like summary results that are easily understood by non-technical individuals. You want details that help the technical individuals figure out what's really going on, recreate this situation if they need to, following a narrative. And you want recommendations for remediation that link back to actual business improvements. So you can address root cause, build your program, and mature your program. I mentioned, good penetration testing isn't disconnected from company objectives. It's not just based on scope, right? You have to understand the environment, you have to understand the attack surface. You can't just run a scanner and and expect that to be the thing. And like I said, vulnerability scans and unfiltered scan reports are not sufficient either. And so the most important thing that I can offer is a good penetration test is not isolated to technical teams only, right? It's important to have business representatives, business leadership involved in the process at the beginning and at the end. We know that technical teams have to be involved primarily in the middle, and they will run point, but those leadership roles should be involved so they understand what's going on. They have a deep understanding of the environment and the risk that they're facing as a business. So a colleague of mine from Risk 360, Ryan Baisden, put together a ebook, Why You Need Penetration Testing. That ebook is available, I think, in the sidebar, and you can certainly go to the link at the bottom. And it talks about, how or why you need penetration testing in this day and age. The thing that I took away from it that was most important was penetration testing is no longer optional. It's your starting point. And when you start at that point and start to look at the results of a penetration test, you start to realize that most environments don't require highly sophisticated actions to get into. Most environments, a scan and some low-hanging fruit, string in a couple of vulnerabilities together, your environment is going to be compromised, right? And that's not because people aren't doing their jobs. It's not because people aren't trying. It's because people haven't been able to look at it the right way. It's maybe a lack of resources available, maybe even a lack of understanding of certain things. And so penetration testing helps you suss a lot of that out if you've never done it before, right? If you've done lightweight penetration testing, going to the next level is going to help you find out more about your environment, more about your capabilities, how resistant you are to attack from an external bad actor. So one of the questions I often get, which is sometimes tough to answer, not all the time, but how likely am I to get attacked? What does it look like out there in the world? What are the biggest threats? We did a CISO roundtable the other day, and the first question from the audience is, what keeps you up at night? Right? And it's an interesting question for CISOs to answer. And first of all, they don't like to answer it because everything that keeps them up at night changes daily. It's one of the few roles where you can come in and something completely unknown hits you in the morning, a brand new thing that was never heard of the night before, and causes your day to go down the tubes. So what keeps you up at night is a tough question to ask, but there are things that you can see and know. And the threat landscape as it stands today is really well quantified in the Verizon Data Breach Investigation Report. They've been publishing this since 2008. I've referenced it regularly. If you're a security leader and you need to pull statistics, it's a fantastic resource for pulling statistics from. And with regard to penetration testing, we're going to look at some high-level statistics regarding the threat landscape, and then dig into and tie it back to how penetration testing can help protect. One important thing to note right out of the gate here is that an incident in the context of this report is a security event that compromises the integrity, confidentiality, or availability of an information asset. In their definition of breach is an incident that results in the confirmed disclosure, not just the potential exposure, of data to an unauthorized party. So Verizon looked at, over 900,000 incidents and almost 235,000 breaches of cybersecurity in 2022. And one statistic that I found quite interesting was that they find that external actors are more common than internal, with 80% of the breaches being caused by external actors. The reason I find that interesting is over the past 2 years, I've seen a lot of conversation and trends around the fact that the insider threat is the biggest threat. Um, Based on their investigation, I would say that that's likely not true, and that external bad actors are your biggest threat still. Internal bad actors are certainly a problem. Internal mistakes are certainly a problem and something that you need to be aware of. But the external perspective still needs to be viewed and evaluated. Next up is the top 2 attack vectors for actual breaches for web applications and email, right? So this kind of makes sense. These are things that are openly available by necessity on the internet. And so they are a very common target for bad actors to try and attack. Web applications we'll talk a little bit more about, but I'll tell a quick story about email. Right, so people might not think of email as being a big deal. So maybe it gets breached, maybe they see, some correspondence, things along those lines. But in the real world, people don't use email the way they're supposed to. And I worked for an organization where we had 2 business email compromises that turned into major issues. One turned into an investigation by a regulatory body, and the other one turned into the breach of multiple personal identity files, and that turned into significant investigation and cost that comes with that. So business email compromise and web breaches are the 2 most popular. Incident types, so these are security events that compromise systems but didn't have a confirmed exposure of data. So denial of service, we think of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. So availability, when you deny service, you shut something down from the outside by either generating too much traffic or turning it off in some way. 40% of the most common incidents were denial of service. Next up, web attacks, which makes sense. System intrusions, which is potentially malware and other forms of intrusion, and then social engineering at 10%. Social engineering at 10% is sort of surprising as well, because phishing still seems to be the most common method of compromising an organization. Up next is the most common cause of a breach. And so system intrusion, web app attacks, and social engineering. So now you're starting to see a little bit more of that social engineering popping up. And that, again, is where somebody sends a phishing email with a link or something where the bad actor can collect credentials or compromise the system, and then further compromise and collect data from the system, exfiltrate that data, and then do whatever they intend to with that data that they've exfiltrated. Most impacted systems are web application servers, cloud or on-prem. So here we talk about cloud again, and just because you're in the cloud doesn't mean you're secure. And this I found to be a very interesting and telling statistic from Verizon, and there's another one from another report that I'll reference here in a second. 13% of the breaches that they analyzed were the result of cloud configuration errors. That's a huge number. And mind you, this isn't because, some bad actor out there had some crazy tool that they could punch holes in security controls. This is because somebody misconfigured a setting on a cloud environment. And it's not surprising that cloud configuration errors are creating problems. If you've ever had to look at a management platform for like Microsoft Azure or Amazon AWS or Google Cloud, what you realize is that they're incredibly complex. There's a ton of stuff. They rename things, especially on the Microsoft side of the world. They rename things, they move things, the links go away. You might have to go to 4 different places to configure one single thing. And if you miss one of those configuration steps, it'll still work. It just may not be secure. So those cloud configuration errors are resulting in a lot of issues, breaches in particular, incidents as well. And it's hard for the people running those environments to know what they're vulnerable to. And that's again where cloud penetration testing is vitally important to help, be a backstop to those guys who are building and configuring those environments. And then last little tidbit here is credentials and personal data are 80% of the targeted data, right? So while intellectual property and other things might be of interest to certain parties in particular nation states, the majority of the bad actors out there are trying to get credentials to further access systems, to access bank accounts, whatever it may be, and collect personal data to do whatever nefarious things they can think of with that PII data. So what does this really tell us? And kind of in summary, bad actors are still the most common cause of breaches, right? And you need to look at your organization from an attacker's perspective. Those external perspectives are vitally important. 35% of attacks or attack vectors used by the bad actors are web application attacks and social engineering. So you need to evaluate how vulnerable you are to web application attacks by web app pen testing and to social engineering through social engineering testing. Cloud configuration errors, I just spent a lot of time on that, so I'm not going to rehash it, but evaluating your cloud posture regularly is vitally important. And then penetration testing just in general helps you evaluate your environment from an attacker's perspective and evaluate the most common cause of incidents and breaches. What that really means is that if you're not doing that, then you don't understand what it looks like from an external perspective, and you don't know how vulnerable you are. All right, so what happens if you are breached? What happens if you experience an incident or a breach? What's the final financial impact to a data breach? What are the real costs? One of the best reports, and they've been doing it for a long time as well, to quantify the cost of a breach is the cost of a data breach report as produced by the Pentesting Institute and now IBM. In conjunction, they put together an analysis of data breaches over 2022. They've been doing it for many, many years. And in 2022, the average cost of a data breach is $9.4 million, $9.44 million, right? So that's a huge number, and it may not jive with what you think of if you've experienced a data breach. It may be a lot more than you think of related to that breach. But it's important to note that within those numbers, there's a bunch of direct and indirect costs that are calculated to come up with that number. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Stolen or compromised credentials are still the most common cause of a data breach. So in that other slide, we saw that credentials are a common target for bad actors. And that target is there because those stolen credentials are then used to further breach the environment, breach the data, and ultimately a data breach based on that could, typically runs about $4.5 million. We talked about cloud misconfiguration, and I talked about how I would tie it back to this other report. Cloud misconfigurations, according to IBM and Pentesting, third most common cause of a data breach, and costing $4.4 million on average. So again, your cloud environments are highly susceptible to misconfiguration that leads to a security issue, and that must be evaluated. I'll run through just a few more of these. 45% of all breaches happen in the cloud. So if you think the cloud is secure, you have to validate that. Trust but verify. The per record cost, and the reason this is bolded is we'll use this later, the per record cost of a data breach is $164. So say you have 10 records breached, that's $1,640, right? And so on and so forth. So this number is really important to help us calculate later an ROI or a cost-benefit analysis. That number is made up of all of the direct and indirect costs associated with the data breach. And this number is highly useful whether you're talking about justifying a penetration testing effort or any other security effort. That cost number right there is key. Another one that I'll point out is the average cost saving associated with regular testing of incident response team and plan was approximately $2.66 million, or a 28% decrease in cost associated with a breach or an incident. So what that really tells us is that if you're testing your incident response capabilities, meaning your teams who are responsible for addressing these incidents as they happen in real time, if they're trained and prepared, you can decrease the associated cost with that incident by almost 28%, somewhere right around there, right? This is really important when we start to think about cost-benefit analysis. It's really important when we think about insurance, which we'll talk about here in just a minute. And one of the key elements of testing those capabilities is penetration testing. In particular, being able to do red team and purple team type of exercises where adversary simulations are occurring and your teams are actively hands-on keyboard involved with stopping those activities. That's the type of training that really helps to result in that 28% decrease in cost. Oh, there we go, sorry about that. So what these numbers tell us is that data breaches are expensive. You know, you cannot get around it. They are very expensive. They cost you in terms of money, they cost you in terms of reputation, they cost you in terms of disrupted business, possibly even lost customers. Data breaches incur both direct and indirect costs. So I talked about, you know, business disruption and revenue loss, but what about forensics and investigative services, audit and assessment services that aren't necessarily required before a data breach, but may be required after a data breach, simply because you want to keep a customer, or a regulator says you need additional audit and assessment. You have the crisis management costs. Point is that there are many, many, many other costs that add up that you may think of, you may not think of. And ultimately, if you're doing the right things, you can reduce your costs by making sure that your team is prepared. One of the things that organizations need to understand is that they have to, you know, sort of share the risk associated with a breach or an incident. And one of the ways to share and mitigate that risk is to transfer some of that risk to a cyber insurance provider, right? So how does cyber insurance work? How does penetration testing tie into cyber insurance? Those are some of the questions that executives might have, and we're going to talk through a little bit of that here. So cyber liability insurance is essentially a requirement in today's business climate. Oftentimes people say it's not a matter of if, it's when, and that is true. You can see it based on the numbers that we've seen so far, and when and how bad are really the questions that you should be asking, you know, and the most important question is, how prepared are we to deal with it, right? So being prepared includes having cyber liability insurance, understanding what those requirements are for the gaining the insurance, and ensuring that a claim will be paid in the event that you make a claim. Insurers nowadays are getting more expensive. Insurance is more expensive. They're providing less coverage, which we'll see here in just a second. And in this Fitch article that's referenced down at the bottom of the page, you'll see that insurers are starting to require specific controls. This may not have been true 5-10 years ago. Now, especially with the advent of ransomware and these big ransomware attacks that they've had to pay out over the past several years, we're to a point now where they're requiring very specific controls, multi-factor authentication, employee awareness training, phishing detection, several others, as well as possibly and likely reviewing the insured's penetration testing results regularly. The reason they do this is they need to understand what the insured environment looks like. When you start to think about insurance in general, you automatically probably think about, underwriters and actuarial tables, and you have ways to quantify risk and the likelihood of something bad happening and the potential cost associated with that. It is very difficult to calculate those things in the cyber realm. One, the environment is constantly changing. And what I mean by that is both sides of the environment. The threat environment is constantly changing. It could be a brand new world every day, where some new thing comes out that breaks the internet. We've seen, several examples of that over the past couple of years. And, it's hard for insurance companies to be able to predict that. Further, on the other side of things, people's environments, their infrastructure, their cloud setups, whatever it may be, are not static, and they're changing constantly. And so it's very difficult for the insurers to figure that out. So they've figured out that some baseline controls and frequent review is important for them to be able to underwrite a policy and manage that environment for a customer. Cyber liability insurance also is cited in this World Economic Forum report, the Global Risks Report from 2022. Fantastic report. If you haven't seen the World Economic Forum reports, I highly suggest them. Great statistics across many different aspects of cybersecurity. They help tremendously when you're trying to justify things, and it's just important information to know. But they call out specifically, that insurance pricing is going up. Pardon me, a 204% year-over-year increase from third quarter of 2021. So not only are they going up, coverages are being reduced, claims are increasing, and the claims related to ransomware are just going through the roof, right, across the world. It's a highly effective attack technique that the bad actors use to get paid. And so the cyber liability insurance providers are the ones that are bearing the brunt of a lot of this. Small companies, large companies, and the insurers. And so they're passing that along by increasing premiums and lowering coverage. Ultimately, they are working on refining their cyber risk models to improve their predictive analysis, as it says there, which is, as I said, very challenging. The data just isn't there. The environments are so very dynamic that it's difficult to do. So it'll be interesting to see where they go from here. There we go. Sorry about that. My screen was not reacting. So penetration testing and cyber insurance, how do they interact together? Most importantly, having a strong security posture is going to ensure that you have coverage, that your claims are going to get approved, and hopefully it will help reduce your premiums if you can demonstrate a truly mature cybersecurity program. One of the key aspects of a mature cybersecurity program is a strong threat and vulnerability management program. Threat and vulnerability management, some people might think of it as just, vulnerability scanning and patching, but there's a lot more to it. And I always categorize penetration testing as part of the threat and vulnerability management program. It's a way to actively emulate bad actors and test your capabilities, your vulnerabilities, and your response processes to ensure that you're prepared when something bad does happen. The one thing that often fails to happen when we think of threat and vulnerability management programs, we think of them as technical programs only, right? And that the IT people and the security people, and maybe the compliance people are the ones that are going to be involved in them. What we need to do is change our thinking there, and we need to get senior leaders of the organization involved. Executive leadership should be deeply involved and play a key role in it, a key role in the oversight, in the support, in the funding, and the closer they are to it, the easier it is for them, for those executives to understand what's being asked, why it's being asked, and feel more comfortable providing money for it. Another really important aspect that you can layer into your threat and vulnerability management program is red teaming and purple teaming. I talked about those earlier, but red team and purple team is one of those key things that can help reduce the cost by 28%, and it will demonstrate another level of commitment and preparedness to your insurance provider. So having your teams engage in those, and when they come to ask you for those, it is something that you should seriously consider, because there is a significant benefit to it. Speaking of benefit, let's get into some examples of the cost-benefit analysis for penetration testing. And so most folks have probably built some form of ROI or cost-benefit analysis calculation in the past. We at Risk 360 and Renegade Labs decided, okay, we're going to try and put together something. I've had to do it in my past lives, and our customers have asked us for it. So we put together a downloadable spreadsheet. It is in the sidebar, and there'll be a QR code here in a second that helps you calculate cost-benefit analysis, ROI, and payback period for a penetration test. Now, this could be extended to be used for other aspects of a cybersecurity program. And note that we had to make a lot of assumptions as we were building this model. When you download it, feel free to change some of those assumptions, feel free to change some of the calculations, but know that it's a good model, a good baseline to use to help justify spend with regard to cybersecurity. So with this, what we did is, you first look at and identify the scope, then you estimate the cost of the actual penetration test, you estimate the potential benefits and assign a monetary value. So that's an important aspect of this, and I'll show you how we did it in this spreadsheet. You calculate annual loss expectancy. There's a sub-calculation there of potential loss per incident. You calculate ROI, and there are different ways to calculate ROI. This is the method that we chose. You determine the payback period, and then you assess the cost-benefit ratio. So we're going to dig into this, and I'll show you an example of it. So this first example, what we're looking at is they have this organization has 240 systems, 2 web apps, 1 cloud instance, 10 different networks. They're small networks spread all over. They have 10,000 PII records, PII data records. Their current annual revenue is $5 million. Current valuation is $24 million. And they expect to have 1 breach per year. You have to pick something. You can pick 0, you can pick 10. They realistically said, okay, we're going to expect to have 1 breach per year. It may be small, may be large, we're not exactly sure. But for purposes of this, our penetration test is $50,000. Our cost per record breached is $164. And so our average loss expectancy is $164 times 5,000. They're only going to save half of these records are going to get breached. Plus the cost of the test, we end up with $820,000 estimated total cost, all right? When we look at benefits, we have to put some stakes in the ground. So we're going to use the 28% reduction in exposure. I fully recognize that 28% reduction in exposure relates to the entirety of the cybersecurity program, but penetration testing and training, the red team, purple team type aspects of things was specifically called out in that report So we're going to take that number and glom onto it. So 28% reduction in potential cost of a breach. Several different sources cite a good cybersecurity program that includes penetration testing can help boost revenue, whether it's through a compliance framework or other means of greasing the skids for sales by at least 2%. Right, so we're going to use that number. You can adjust it up or down if you're playing with this, but 2% of revenue, and then increased valuation. So by having these certifications, by demonstrating a strong cybersecurity program, by demonstrating a strong commitment, your valuation can increase as much as 1%. So if we take all of that, the total estimated monetary value of the benefits is, just a little under $570,000. When we run our ROI calculations, we come back with $10.39 of return for every dollar we spend on penetration testing, 0.09 years, and then $11.39 of benefit for every dollar spent on penetration testing. So you can see that it's a very simple business case to be made. There's a strong ROI, there's a great cost benefit ratio, and if you take this approach, adjust it to your environment, it's going to resonate with the folks who are writing the bills. And so I've found that this type of approach has been very useful in working with non-technical people who control budgets and are questioning why they need to spend as much as they do on a penetration test. So let's say you meet with these folks, you go through these numbers, and they say, well, we shouldn't be expecting a breach every year. And, they're right. Maybe they shouldn't. And maybe more realistically, it's once every 5 years. So, you can say, all right, even without an expected breach this year and no annual loss expectancy, the benefit in terms of revenue increase and current valuation increase still creates a positive ROI and positive cost benefit ratio, right? Again, you might want to play with these numbers and tweak them. The best approach that I would suggest is, as you're building this business case, work with the CFO or whomever and talk to them and get their perspective on how much of an increase it might allow for, and agree to those numbers, and then use those numbers going forward for not just calculating this, but other efforts under your security umbrella. So at this point, I'm going to just kind of transition in and talk very briefly about what Risk 360 does, Renegade Labs, how we can help, and then I'm going to open it up to questions. So Risk 360 and Renegade Labs, as I mentioned, we have security offerings. Some of those security offerings are our penetration testing offerings. We do network penetration testing, web app and API penetration testing, and cloud penetration testing. We follow standard frameworks. We have certifications for our labs engineers, and we also offer red team and purple team. If you want to learn more about it, visit risk360.com and look at our penetration testing solutions, and you can dig a little bit deeper. Our methodology is pretty easy. It's a 3-step approach. We do scoping and planning, and within that scoping and planning, we ensure that we, meet with management. We ensure that we outline what the goals and objectives are, and we work with the organization to make sure that we're going to provide the most value possible. We do our field work and our testing. We have different methodologies, different tool sets that we use. We have expertise across the board. And once we're done with our testing, then we put together our reports. Our reports are fantastic. There's some samples out there that you can look at. I highly suggest if you're in the market, take a look. And then finally, one of the unique things about how we deliver information to our clients is we use the Phalanx GRC platform. That's a platform built here at Risk 360 by our craftsmen and professionals. And we communicate through the platform. We provide results through that platform. And over time, as you grow and mature your program, you can leverage other portions of that platform to support your program, your compliance and security program. Phalanx GRC is one of the very unique things about Risk 360. It's a software as a service platform that I'm very proud to be a part of. The team is fantastic that builds it, and the functionality is great. As I mentioned, it was built by us for us initially, and now we're bringing it out to the world. And so it has a very unique perspective. So at this point, I think we have about 9 minutes left, and I wanted to open it up to any questions that anyone might have.
Thank you, Kevin. We actually have 5 right now, and anyone online that has questions, please feel free to ask. So we'll start with this one. I have a limited budget for penetration testing each year, but a complicated scope and a lot of systems I would like to access. How would you approach scoping and prioritizing pen testing?
Yeah, so that's a very, very common scenario. You know, complicated environment, not enough money to cover it all, not enough time to cover it all. So generally what we like to do is we like to meet with you, and you know, one of the questions that we always ask is what would be the worst case scenario? You know, and based on that answer, we then start to focus in on the systems that would, if compromised, result in that worst case scenario. So there's threat mapping exercises that you can go through. We can help you do some of those. Laying out your attack surfaces, understanding your environment, understanding where your crown jewels are, and the most likely paths to get to those crown jewels. You start with that, and then we test those paths to make sure that the most likely paths are secure. And then over time, you start to expand the testing, you know, maybe later in the year or year 2. And as you continue to test and show either secure environments or issues that you're fixing, it becomes easier and easier to increase your budget to be able to provide the coverage that you need. So hopefully that answered your question. It starts with understanding where your crown jewels are and the most likely paths, and then focusing on testing that.
Okay, the next question is penetration testing required for frameworks like ISO, SOC, and PCI?
Indeed. In some cases, it is required. In other cases, it is not. At the end of the day, penetration testing is a best practice, and most auditors and most insurers are going to expect that it's in place. Third parties who you might be looking to do business with, who may not even require compliance with a framework like SOC 2 or ISO, they are going to be looking for it as well. They'll have their checklist. They'll be looking for penetration testing and remediation of the findings. So while it might not be a requirement everywhere, it certainly is, should be considered a requirement by every organization.
Okay, the next question is, how often should a pen test be done for a web application?
That's another great question. You know, and a lot of people might differ on this in terms of what they think of in terms of timing. From my perspective, if you have a fairly static web application, 1 to 2 times a year is a good frequency for your penetration testing. If you have a web application that you release updates to on a very regular cadence prior to release or just after release, you should be testing fairly regularly, right? And there's differing levels of test, maybe just some automated testing at release time and then more intensive testing 1 to 2 times a year. Or if you are protecting very sensitive information, every time you release, you would want a full-blown web application penetration test. So a lot of it depends on the nature of the application, the nature of the data stored in the application, the level of security that you believe is necessary for your environment. So I'll say minimally 1 to 2 times a year. And then if you're really concerned about it, before every release.
Okay, our next question is, can you provide any recommendations on how I can access a quality pen test versus a poor quality pen test? Are there any questions or things to look out for in the firm as well as the report itself?
Sure. So one of the things that you can ask early on is ask what kind of tools they use, and then what type of manual testing they do based on the results from those tools. If they have to dance around on the second part of that question, then you're going to know that they're primarily focused on automation and not the human aspect of things. Another thing that you can ask is for a sample of their report, and you can look at it. And when you look at it, you're going to want to look for these key elements. You're going to want to look for a very concise and easy to understand executive summary. You're going to want to look for narratives on what was done, how it was done with a lot of technical detail. You're going to want to look for in those narratives things that are somewhat complex, where you would take multiple vulnerabilities, string them together to end up with a finding, a compromised system. And that is going to tell you, okay, this organization does a very professional job. They understand, how to actually string things together to emulate an attacker and to test an environment properly. And then last but not least, supporting detail with recommendations and making sure that those recommendations are in line with the business's infrastructure and objectives. So if you get a sample report, you look for those key things, you're going to know that is a high quality penetration test. Are there any other questions, Corey?
Yeah, we have 2 more. When should you use a purple team instead of a red team for a pen test?
So it's a good question. So I would say a purple team is great at different life cycles of an incident response program. If you have untrained individuals who are your incident responders who haven't been through it, don't know the processes, doing a purple team where you're working with a red team who's emulating the adversary, and then you also have their expertise to help guide you through the response process. It's a fantastic exercise to help train and teach your team how to handle those situations. So you can do it early on in a program, or you can do it at any point within a program. Red teaming, when when maybe you're taking a more critical look at things, you expect your teams to be trained, you expect your teams to have implemented controls that are actually going to work, and you want to validate that. That's where a red team is really good, because you come in, you agree to the different scenarios, the different TTPs, that exercise is run, and it's pass fail on each one of those agreed to scenarios. So when you're trying to validate what you expect, red teaming is great. When you're trying to build capability, purple teaming is great.
Okay, we have one last question. Unless anyone else has any additional ones, please feel free. But here's the last one. What is your take on continuous pen testing versus quarterly versus annual?
Well, I would say the more frequent testing, the better results and the faster that you can find issues and vulnerabilities. I would also say that, in practice, continuous penetration testing is going to be difficult for a lot of organizations simply because of the cost involved. And as you automate it more, the less valuable it becomes. So what I've always done is I've always done a minimum of 2 tests per year. And so keep in mind, I've been in the industry a long time, and I've sat on the other side of the table. And in those roles, I've always done 2 penetration tests a year, and I've always rotated, the teams that are doing those tests, meaning having different perspectives. And it could be using the same organization twice, but different testers, but trying to get different perspectives. So minimum of 2 times a year, and then the continuous testing, I would love for it to be something that more companies could do, but financially and time commitment wise, it's a bit of a challenge.